Omar Khayyam is remembered by many as the poet of the Rubaiyat, the man who wrote verses about the fleeting nature of life, the taste of wine, and the beauty of the moment. But to leave him only as a poet is to miss the greater truth of his genius. Khayyam was not only a master of words but also a scientist, a mathematician, a philosopher, and a thinker whose reflections on time and existence continue to echo across centuries. His story is not just about verses in Persian literature, but about the human struggle to reconcile science and faith, certainty and doubt, eternity and transience. To speak of Omar Khayyam is to speak of a man who stood at the intersection of reason and imagination, whose life shows us how a human being can touch infinity with both the pen of poetry and the logic of science. Omar Khayyam was born in 1048 in Nishapur, a city in northeastern Persia, during a period when the Islamic Golden Age was flourishing. This was a time when Baghdad, Nishapur, and other cities of the Muslim world were centers of learning that rivaled ancient Athens and Alexandria. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine were being advanced by great minds, and Omar was a product of this intellectual flowering. From a young age, he showed a deep brilliance. His teachers recognized that he was not only gifted in memorization, as most scholars of his time were, but also in understanding and questioning. He questioned the assumptions behind knowledge itself. This was unusual, because in a world where religious authority and established traditions were dominant, questioning was a bold act. As a mathematician, Khayyam contributed works that would influence centuries of thought. He wrote treatises on algebra, revising and extending the works of earlier scholars. In fact, the word algebra itself comes from the Arabic al-jabr, and Khayyam was one of the men who took the subject to new heights. He classified cubic equations and sought geometric methods to solve them, a pursuit that would not be fully solved until the Renaissance in Europe, hundreds of years later. For Khayyam, numbers were not just abstractions, they were keys to unlocking the structure of the universe. His work shows a mind that saw patterns where others saw only confusion, a mind that sought unity in the midst of complexity. But perhaps even more astonishing than his mathematics was his role in reforming the Persian calendar. At the request of Sultan Malik Shah, Omar Khayyam led a team of astronomers to correct the Islamic calendar. The result was the Jalali calendar, introduced in 1079, which was astonishingly precise. In fact, the Jalali calendar was more accurate in measuring the length of the year than the Julian calendar of Europe and even rivaled the Gregorian calendar that would only appear centuries later. For Khayyam, time was not just a poetic theme, it was something he measured with extraordinary scientific skill. He was a man who gazed at the stars not only to dream but also to calculate, who looked at the heavens and saw both the mystery of God and the order of mathematics. Yet it is his poetry that has immortalized him for millions. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of quatrains, is where his voice speaks most intimately to us. These verses, simple yet profound, question the meaning of life, the inevitability of death, and the fleeting nature of time. They speak of wine, but often the wine is a metaphor for joy, for freedom, for the brief intoxication of existence. One of his recurring themes is the awareness that life is short, that no one escapes the grave, and therefore the wise person learns to live fully in the present moment. This is not the hedonism of a man who abandons responsibility, but the wisdom of one who sees the futility of clinging to permanence. Khayyam reminds us that we are dust and shadow, yet in the midst of that fragility, we have the power to taste beauty. There is a tension in his verses. On the one hand, they reflect the skepticism of a philosopher who doubts religious dogma and rigid answers. On the other hand, they carry the deep yearning of a soul who longs to find meaning in a universe that often appears indifferent. Khayyam's skepticism was not the cold rejection of belief but the honest recognition that human knowledge is limited. He dared to ask questions about God, fate, and free will that many feared to ask. Some of his lines suggest that perhaps God is beyond human comprehension, that all our attempts to explain eternity are like children drawing shapes in the sand. At the same time, his poetry affirms that while the mysteries of existence remain unsolved, we are given the gift of the present moment, and that is enough. It is this paradox, skepticism mixed with reverence, doubt blended with wonder, that makes Omar Khayyam a timeless figure. He was a scientist who measured time, yet a poet who admitted that time ultimately escapes us. He was a mathematician who solved equations, yet a philosopher who recognized that the greatest equation, the meaning of life, has no clear solution. His work reminds us that the human mind must balance reason and imagination, that knowledge without humility becomes arrogance, and that poetry without thought becomes empty. The Rubaiyat gained global fame not in Khayyam's lifetime but centuries later, when Edward Fitzgerald translated his quatrains into English in the 19th century. Fitzgerald's version was not a literal translation but a poetic rendering that captured the spirit of Khayyam's words. In Victorian England, where strict morality and religious seriousness prevailed, Khayyam's verses about wine, pleasure, and the brevity of life struck like a thunderbolt. They offered a reminder that life is not only about duty and discipline but also about savoring the moment. Through Fitzgerald, Omar Khayyam became a household name in Europe, influencing poets, thinkers, and even scientists who saw in his quatrains a philosophy of life that transcended time and culture. But behind the poetic fame lies the deeper legacy of Omar Khayyam. His scientific achievements remind us that the Muslim world once led the world in knowledge, in discovery, in the pursuit of truth. His mathematical methods laid foundations for later developments in geometry and algebra. His calendar reform was a triumph of human reason. His philosophy reflected the courage to doubt in an age when doubt was dangerous. And his poetry gave voice to universal human emotions that cross borders, languages, and centuries. To understand Omar Khayyam today is to confront our own paradoxes. We live in a world where science has advanced beyond imagination, where we can measure time to the fraction of a second, where we can peer into galaxies billions of light-years away. Yet we also live in a world where meaning often escapes us, where we still ask the same questions Khayyam asked nearly 1,000 years ago. What is the purpose of life? Why do we suffer? Is there a God who cares, or is the universe indifferent? His verses remind us that even in the face of uncertainty, we can live fully. Even when we cannot answer the big questions, we can still taste the sweetness of the moment. When Khayyam writes of wine, we must see it not merely as literal drink but as a metaphor for awakening, for breaking free from the chains of worry about the past and the future. When he writes of time's passing, he is reminding us that life is fragile, that the hourglass is always emptying, and that we must not waste our days in illusions. When he speaks of the grave, he is not being morbid but honest, reminding us that to ignore death is to fail to live authentically. His wisdom is deeply stoic in some ways, recognizing the limits of control, urging acceptance of fate, and yet finding joy in what we can embrace. Omar Khayyam's life and thought carry lessons for us today. In an age of anxiety, when people seek certainty in ideologies, Khayyam teaches us to embrace uncertainty with courage. In a world obsessed with progress and future planning, he reminds us to live in the now. In a culture where science and spirituality are often pitted against each other, Khayyam's example shows us that one mind can embrace both calculation and contemplation, both astronomy and poetry. He reminds us that human greatness lies not in having all the answers but in asking the right questions and living authentically in their shadow. And so, when we reflect on Omar Khayyam, we see a figure who was more than a poet, more than a scientist, more than a philosopher. He was a man who lived the mystery of being human. He measured the heavens but acknowledged the limits of human vision. He solved equations but admitted the riddles of existence. He wrote verses that made kings pause and common people reflect. His wisdom is not locked in the 11th century, it speaks directly to us, here and now. Khayyam's legacy is that of balance, reason and imagination, science and art, skepticism and wonder. He shows us that human beings need both the precision of mathematics and the passion of poetry to live fully. He reminds us that time is both infinite and fleeting, that we are small yet significant, temporary yet capable of touching eternity through thought and beauty. His life and words are an invitation to question without fear, to live without regret, and to embrace the mystery of time not as a burden but as a gift. Omar Khayyam, the man of science and poetry, leaves us with this timeless truth, that while we may never solve the riddle of existence, we can live beautifully within it. We can honor both the infinite sky above us and the fragile breath within us. We can recognize that the present moment, fleeting as it is, contains eternity. And in that recognition lies both wisdom and peace.